Geeks, let's talk about my favorite group of mutants.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
No, not these ones. Or those. Okay, those aren't even mutants. They are aliens. I was talking about the X-Men. No, not this series. No. Okay, you know what? We have spent way too much time on this lame joke. Just roll the opening. Based on the Marvel comic book series of the same name, the show follows a group of super-powered beings whose abilities begin to blossom around the teenage years thanks to their genetic mutation. Hence, they are called mutants. And while the show cemented itself in the cultural zeitgeist today, I would like to shine the light behind the curtains of X-Men the Animated Series. The show runs uphill battles with network executives, shady marketing ploys, and one awesome theme song. And with that being said,
This one's for you, Mark.
Between the mid-1970s and 1990s, X-Men comics were one of Marvel Comics' hottest properties, selling millions of copies time after time. It was a best-selling comic. It had a hit video game, albeit one based on Pride of the X-Men. And this wasn't a coincidence. Around this time, X-Men were a stand-in for a lot of issues dealing with the Red Scare, racism, LGBTQ rights, and diversity. With this momentum, you would think TV executives everywhere would be tripping over themselves to get X-Men for their network. But it wasn't that simple. Margaret Loesch, the head of Fox Kids at the time, fought to get this show off the ground. She championed it so much that it could have cost her job and possibly her entire career. In the world of entertainment, even a modestly budget kids show is still a multi-million-dollar gamble. The network executives had to be convinced that the show can and will succeed to keep people employed, or not only the show, but also the small network itself could go bankrupt. It also didn't help that from 1966 to 1989, none of the Marvel cartoons were ever a major hit. The quality of animation was severely limited, the writing was awful, and stories were entertaining only because of how bizarre and nonsensical they were.
I made it out of wood.
He tricked me with a wooden gun.
Now, all this doesn't mean the people behind them didn't try, but it was clear that none of them stood the test of time. On top of that, the network's recent successes had been young, light, and funny, whereas X-Men the Animated Series was older, dark, and intense. It seems as though the entire thing was destined to fail just as the previous X-Men animation attempt, Pride of the X-Men.
When we were trying to get the X-Men on the air,
Margaret
with Margaret Loesch and Stan Lee, we came out, they found the financing to do a pilot called Pride of the X-Men. And it was a half-hour pilot. We got Japanese animation, we got the best script we thought we had at the time. And right then, they only had three networks, CBS, NBC, ABC. Nobody was interested in the show.
It featured the now infamous casting of an Australian to play a Canadian Wolverine. I mean, can you imagine an Australian playing a Canadian? Okay, I take it back. Despite all the warning signs, Fox TV decided to take a chance with X-Men. Towards the end of the 80s, there was a shift in weekly animated series to take on a more mature tone. And thanks to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles animated series and movie, it was proven that comic book characters could appeal to fans of all ages. Now, to craft the series, Eric Lewald was picked for the job. The problem was, while Eric did read a few comics, being put in charge of a show with as much history as X-Men meant he had some catching up to do. The advantage to having a starting point like the hundreds of X-Men books is that a great deal of decisions have been made for you. You're not staring at a blank page and asking yourself, what type of stories do we tell? About what characters? About what time? But at the same time, if you stay true to the source material, you're stuck with what you've got. You don't like the Scott Summers character? Sorry, he's a lead, and you've got to feature him. Excited about doing something out of character with Wolverine? 2 million comic fans may not appreciate it. Lewald crafted what would become the series Bible. For those who don't know, the series Bible is basically a book that contains every piece of information about the characters, events, and plot details. This could include details such as the height and eye color of the character and which characters have met. The series Bible begins its life long before the show gets on the air and only keeps expanding as the series progresses, making notes on what events took place and when they fit chronologically. The team was adamant about making this series the best it could ever be, bringing in co-creator of Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, and Nightcrawler, Len Wein. Len was partially responsible for bringing X-Men back to the public eye in 1975 after a 5-year hiatus. Lewald said, "Don't be like previous attempts. Don't write down to children. Don't pander. Don't just play at Jeopardy. Do remain true to the source material. Do establish a core theme. Do out the X-Men. Do establish believable X-Men vulnerability. Do tell personal stories." Mark Edens and Eric Lewald laid out the first 26 stories. We showed superheroes as realistic adult characters in serious dramas. This was a risk, but the resulting worldwide success helped expand the audience who appreciated the comic books into the hundreds of millions who watched our show. Even when they were constrained by censors, they found intelligent ways to skirt around those restrictions to make everything they wanted in the show work. This was especially apparent in the death of Morph in the first episode.
Yeah.
We need someone to die. We need an X-Men, not just someone on the side. We need an X-Men to die in the first story to show what the stakes are for these people. So it's not play acting, it's not play fighting, it's real.
It took lots of carefully crafted memos back and forth, and it was agreed that killing a character would bring the audience closer to the surviving X-Men who cared for him. Now, X-Men the Animated Series is sprinkled with Easter eggs in the form of cameos from the other Marvel-owned characters, like Deadpool and Miss Marvel. However, the lawyers were very picky when it came to including outside characters. Even bringing Captain America on the show was a result of the creative team asking for months for permission to use him. So, the team had to get creative. When presenting the storyboards, the cameo characters were simply named Mutant 1 or Mutant 2.
There was one episode where these guys wrote called Genosha.
Slave Island.
And Slave Island, that's the
Island.
one. Yeah. And the writer wrote Mutant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That's how Magical Mutant was turned into Doctor Strange, and Norse Mutant into Thor, and African Mutant into Black Panther. A friendly neighborhood mutant was, you guessed it, Spider-Man, even if his face was never shown. Around this time, Marvel was hurting financially and needed X-Men the Animated Series to be a success. So it didn't help that the show's pilot episode, Night of the Sentinels, was filled with animation errors. Furthermore, the executive had a major problem with the lineup chosen for the X-Men, as well as the lack of Magneto in the pilot episode in favor of the Sentinels. Despite some early headbutting between Marvel and Lewald's crew, the two ultimately wanted a high-quality show. Thus, in a show of faith, Marvel sacrificed their fee to redo the pilot. Now, the initial loss of income was more than paid back after Night of the Sentinels became a hit, and by hit I mean that it sold a ton of toys because that's how most cartoons make their money back. Merchandise. Speaking of merchandise, have you checked out the links in the description? Sorry, save it for the end. To save money, they recorded all the show's dialogue in Canada, since the Canadian SAG's rules don't require residuals on reruns. Word on the street is Haim Saban, one of the show's producers, is notoriously cheap. This in turn led to the casting of stage actors for the cartoon, giving it its unique voice. Hell, Storm received not one, but 3 of them. The first actress was dismissed because she was white, and Storm was the team's only black member. The showrunners realized that perhaps people might not appreciate the fact that the actress who voiced Storm on the series, the most prominent black character on the show, was actually a white woman. So they quickly brought in actress Iona Morris to re-record all of Storm's lines. But she would later be dismissed because she was American, and the show had intentionally cast Canadian voice actors because their guilds had a more cost-effective pay structure that required no residuals for reruns. We've been over this, you get it. Finally, the show settled on black Canadian actress Alison Seeley Smith. Seeley Smith was the voice of Storm from Season 2 onwards. However, they also had her re-record all of Storm's lines in Season 1 as well. Morris's voice was used in the original airing of each episode, but in the reruns, Seeley Smith's voice would replace Morris's so that the series could avoid having to pay Morris residuals for her work that they would have owed her every time they reran one of her episodes. But the story does not end there. During the Secret Wars event in Spider-Man the Animated Series, Storm was the only member of the team to make an appearance. None of the other X-Men were able to show up for the episode because they were Canadian. While the original script actually included the entire team, transporting the voice cast to Los Angeles, where production of Spider-Man was based, from Toronto, where X-Men was recorded, proved way too costly. So, the episode was rewritten to include only Storm, which is when actress Iona Morris was brought up against since she already lived in Los Angeles. The team expressed their interest in basing the design on the drawings of Jim Lee, who had worked on the X-Men series selling millions of copies. But funny enough, it coincided with his desire to leave Marvel alongside of other illustrating giants like Todd McFarlane, Jim Valentino, Mark Silvestri, and Rob Liefeld. As a result, higher-ups at Marvel were hesitant to base their animation of the leaving artist. So, the team reworked the animation to look like it came out of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, and executives were instantly convinced that the show had to look like a Jim Lee painting. And of course, I have to mention the show's awesome theme song, composed by Ron Wasserman, that acts as an additional member of the team. It wasn't always as cool as it is now.
I was writing everything for Saban. They would have a commercial and say you need to score it. Say, we have the show Sweet Valley High, you need to write the theme.
Wasserman was previously known as the man who composed 1990s TV earworm The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers theme song. From start to finish, Power Rangers took Wasserman just 2 hours. But composing X-Men's now iconic theme wasn't all that simple.
By this time, people were getting involved, so there was always a note, and we ended up, I don't know, with 100+ tracks. I think there's 20 tracks of hi-hats on the thing alone, because nothing was ever big enough. It needs to be bigger and louder. It was pretty frustrating, I can remember that. It was going to be so heavy sound effects-wise, and I do remember distinctly saying there's no good way to sing X-Men.
Now, ironically, the very first attempt of bringing the X-Men to television did feature exactly that. And if you wish to know more about the theme song for the X-Men, a certain nerd made a video detailing this catchy tune. The link is in the description down below, but hey, not so fast. Let's finish this video first. Equally iconic was the show's title sequence that was designed by Will Mignot and Larry Houston. The original version included everybody the producers had intended to show up. However, Fox panicked, worried there would be too many characters on the show. He had focused on the concept of being hunted and hiding with more moody and shadowy stuff. However, the opening was too slow and not the direction they wanted. Mignot redrew the opening scenes, settling on the faster-paced action that it ended up being. While talking on the phone with Sidney Iwanter, Mignot began drawing individual character shots. Some of the elements of that introduction ended up in the final version. Houston billboarded their names and showcased their mutant powers as dynamically as possible, and Mignot came up with the idea of the name logos flying in so everyone got an introduction. But the weirdest question asked about the titles concerns the little green man with the big bald head. Who is he? Fan sites have hazarded guesses. I thought I just didn't know the books well enough. But Larry recently told me that the bald guy was a mistake by ACOM that they wouldn't fix. He isn't anybody. Who he may have been meant to be has long been forgotten. He's just another example of a flaw caused by lack of time and money, but one that seems to have been forgiven by the fans. Originally, Stan Lee was going to narrate the opening, just like he had narrated for Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and Pride of the X-Men. However, Spider-Man had to pay royalties to Lee for reruns, so the decision was made to make it without narration. Eric Lewald did try to make a narration for the opening titles, though, featuring Stan delivering lines as Professor X. It went something like this. Our world is experiencing a great transformation. Genetic mutations have caused the emergence of a new species whose members possess powers so fantastic that they challenge the very notion of what it means to be human. As fear of these super beings spreads among normal human populations, the mutants struggle to find their rightful place in societies around the globe. But fear breeds distrust and hatred. Mutants are being prosecuted. Some are fighting back. A peace must be found. Only then can humans and mutants build the trust and understanding needed to make the world safe for us all. I am Professor Charles Xavier. I have dedicated my life to teaching mutants to use their powers to help find a way for mutants and humans to live together. The X-Men, men and women with extraordinary powers, are my students, my children, my life. They fight for a better future for us all. They are the world's last best hope. Lewald noted that his goal with X-Men the Animated Series was largely the same as Stan's goal with the Fantastic Four in their debut. Both men wanted to prove superhero stories were not a turnoff for older consumers. In fact, the opposite was true. 1990's Stan Lee, however, had his own ideas about the format for X-Men. He imagined himself appearing at his desk, in live action, to introduce the show to the youngsters. He would then appear again at the end of each episode to say something like, "Hey, wasn't that great, kiddos?" I'll stop with the impression. But believe it or not, he wanted to narrate the title sequence and narrate over the episodes themselves. However, these suggestions were met with anger from Eric Lewald, who admitted to wanting to punch Stan. It's important to remember that Stan Lee was far removed from the X-Men books by 1992.
There was a Stan Lee Jack Kirby version in the early 60s, which was a bunch of white teenage Americans in blue suits, and then it died because it was not a very strong book and for 5 years, and then it was brought back to life by Len Wein and Chris Claremont and John Byrne.
We found ourselves being given the responsibility to shepherd the legacy of a really important series of comics and hold a vision together that we all agreed on. If it was a third-level Marvel guy, he wouldn't have a leg to stand on. But Stan had leverage. Ultimately, the showrunners prevailed, and the Lewalds were quick to point out they didn't hold a grudge against Stan the Man, having worked with and for and next to him in the years since. And while Stan Lee didn't appear on the show, he did get to appear on Spider-Man, the animated series, and the Marvel movies have provided him with more than a few live-action appearances.
Hey, wait, where are you going? Hey, you were supposed to be my lift home.
The stories adapted from the cartoon were primarily from the 1970s and 1980s. The two-part pilot episode Night of the Sentinels features the Mutant Registration Act, which was first used in Days of Future Past from Uncanny X-Men number 141. Also, the battle at the shopping mall is adapted from Jubilee's first appearance in the story Ladies' Night from Uncanny X-Men number 244. And if you recall, in that story, Jubilee is attacked by the M Squad and is rescued by female X-Men. And in the final sequence wherein Jubilee arrives at the X-Mansion is based on a similar sequence when Kitty Pryde first arrived at the X-Mansion following the funeral for Phoenix in Elegy from X-Men number 138. The episode Whatever It Takes, featuring a flashback depicting Mjolnir's birth, is based on the story Life, Death 2 from Uncanny X-Men number 198. In that story, Storm discovered Shawnee's tribe after losing her mutant powers and resuscitated Shawnee's unnamed son, as in the episode. The story also featured a tribal elder named Mjolnir who chose to die when Shawnee's son was born so that the tribe would not become too numerous for its resources. Captive Hearts is loosely based on events depicted in Catacombs and Dancin' in the Dark from Uncanny X-Men number 169 to 170. The Cure features a flashback to Rogue's origins, detailing her kiss with Cody Robbins, which is adapted from Public Enemy in Uncanny X-Men number 185. And in the episode Slave Island, Genosha's treatment of mutants as slave labor is adapted from Welcome to Genosha, /Busting Loose, /Who is Human, /Gonna Be a Revolution in Uncanny X-Men number 235 to number 238. When Chris Claremont and John Byrne wrote the comic book stories, this was a clever decision since 1980s X-Men comics were extremely popular. I mean, think about it. They featured the most iconic stories like the Dark Phoenix Saga, Days of the Future Past, Proteus Saga, and many others. I mean, they now had iconic villains like Apocalypse, Mr. Sinister, and Hellfire Club, just to name a few. The series always had some of the otherworldly villains in the form of giant robots and time-traveling threats. But the series never forgot to explore more grounded social issues such as prejudice, intolerance, isolation, and racism. Other issues that were handled in a less obvious manner were divorce, religious prejudice, the Holocaust, AIDS hysteria, and feelings of loneliness. Even more subtle was the idea of sexual orientation and gender identity in the series. In various episodes, Morph and Mystique would change forms and flirt with either sex depending on their form.
A woman named Avery Coburn.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Save
Yeah.
the show.
You don't
Save it.
hear much praise heaped on what you call the network censors, but that woman was responsible for allowing X-Men to be the show it was.
The X-Men are hated, feared, and despised collectively by humanity for no other reason than that they are mutants. So what we have here, intended or not, is a book that is about racism, bigotry, and prejudice. However, it has been remarked that attitudes towards mutants do not make sense in the context of the Marvel Universe, since non-mutants with similar powers are rarely regarded with fear. X-Men editor Ann Nocenti remarked that, "I think that's literary, really, because there is no difference between Colossus and the Torch. If a guy comes into my office in flames or a guy comes into my office and turns to steel, I'm gonna have the same reaction. It doesn't really matter that I know their origins." As a book, the X-Men has always represented something different. Their powers arrive at puberty, making them analogous to the changes you go through at adolescence, whether they're special or out of control or setting you apart, the misfit identity theme. The original short summary for the first 2 episodes of the X-Men animated series reads something like this. Episodes 1 and 2, mutant/human political conflict is established. Human fears have led governments to begin registering mutants. The National Security Council Bureau of Mutant Affairs, headed by Henry Gyrick, is using a force of huge robots, Sentinels, to keep track of them. Unknown to the public, a conspiracy within the Bureau, led by Gyrick, is secretly changing the robots' mission from mutant control to mutant elimination. The Sentinels attack 13-year-old Jubilee's family. She is saved by the X-Men. We are introduced to many of the X-Men, Dr. Xavier, and their headquarters through Jubilee's eyes. At the same time, she is discovering her new mutant powers. She has to sneak away, is captured by the Sentinels, and saddened X-Men believe she is dead. Xavier's patience with the Sentinels is at an end. They must be stopped. The X-Men raid the National Security Council to get the registration files used by the Sentinels to identify and attack mutants. There's a battle. The files are successfully destroyed, but X-Man Thunderbird is killed, and X-Man Beast is captured by the police.
Comic books had a character called Thunderbird, which was an American Indian character who dies in the first 3 or 4 issues of the book. And to introduce the first American Indian character and then kill him off,
Right, yeah.
So it wouldn't look so good.
So, they decided to go a different direction. While researching X-Men history, Eric came across a character named Changeling who was chosen because of his past ties to the X-Men, as well as his long absence from the Marvel Comics. However, they were told that there was a problem.
But we couldn't use the word Changeling because DC had Changeling in the Teen Titans.
Since the legal team didn't wish to go to court over a character like Changeling, the character had to be modified. Thus, Changeling became Morph, who has the exact same powers and a similar look as the original Changeling. It also helped the writers to do whatever they want, since he was mostly designed as a blank slate. He was written as a funny character whose death would affect Wolverine. Killing a loner like Thunderbird would not have the same impact. To their surprise, they soon found out that kids loved Morph, and the network kept pushing them to bring Morph back to life. And if you recall, in a very soap opera move, he came back in the 2nd season. Now, Thunderbird ended up appearing only in the opening credits and then briefly in a cameo with several other captured mutants. He was featured as a villain in the opening credits for the simple reason that they had too many heroes in the credits and they wanted to balance things out. Thus, Thunderbird got placed on the villain side in the credits. X-Men was supposed to air in September 1992, but due to problems with the animation, the show was pushed back to January 1993.
Benefit of that is that when we came on in January, all the other shows were in reruns. So we were the only new show out there in January, so all the eyeballs went to the X-Men.
It worked out.
It worked out.
nicely.
Yeah.
The show debuted on October 31st, 1992. By the time X-Men hit the air, Batman the Animated Series was already breaking all sorts of new grounds for an animated show for kids. In fact, both Batman and X-Men were playing on the same channel with a few of the same people overseeing the production of both shows. Batman was given a 5-day-a-week run versus X-Men's Saturday morning slot. Batman was built in 2-part acts or one-offs. X-Men dealt its series in more of a serial nature. Because of this, X-Men more often felt meatier, taking classic stories from the pages of the comics and adapting them to 22-minute installments was a major achievement. Take, for example, the Phoenix Saga. Here, 10 months worth of stories were tightly adapted into 5 episodes, an otherwise unheard of birth of shows for a kid to mull through. Showrunner Eric Lewald and his team found the right balance between long arcs and one-offs. Case in point, the lone episode was dedicated to Colossus. But this isn't the only connection with Batman the Animated Series. Just like Batman introduced Harley Quinn to the comics, the X-Men Animated Series inspired the comics and later the film's famous love triangle between Scott, Jean, and Wolverine, and it loosely inspired Age of Apocalypse from the episode One Man's Worth, Part 1. However, the episode had to be written, voiced, and animated for several months, which is why the episode might have predated the comic book even if it came out much later. One Man's Worth was a story I came up with and one of the ones I was most proud of. But it's also a reminder. Most good stories have been told many times in many different forms. Writers of all ages and all times borrow plot points from each other. I borrowed from It's a Wonderful Life and City on the Edge of Forever for the central idea. What would the world have been like without this one crucial man? It's all in the execution. One Man's Worth came out well. So did Age of Apocalypse. If we or the comics writers had done weaker work, using a good idea wouldn't have helped us. That's a reason I never had a prejudice for original material over adaptations. There are so many hundreds of creative decisions to make in any story. By the end, you've made it personal. The series had originally been set to end with Beyond Good and Evil, a 4-part story centered on the Darwinism-loving villain Apocalypse in Season 4. Early drafts of the script would have altered the makeup of the team, with Professor X leaving to start a new school with the youngest member Jubilee going with him, and Cyclops and Jean Grey leaving as well to start a family. They would have been replaced by new members Archangel, Psylocke, Bishop, and Shard. Another X-Man may even have died. Instead, the network ordered 11 more episodes, and it was decided the cast could not change, including the episode Have Yourself a Morlock Little Xmas, which even the creators of the show admit might not have been all that good. The later episodes also had a much lower budget, which led to even more animation errors and constantly degrading look. Due to tight scheduling, a lot of episodes were even aired out of order. No Mutant is an Island was supposed to air after the 5-part Phoenix Saga in Season 3, as it dealt with Cyclops' grief following the perceived death of Jean Grey. Instead, it aired 2 years later as an out-of-place flashback. It was a 2-year fight to get them to redo the episode. All of the troubles culminated in the show's cancellation, partly because Fox didn't wish to continue making a cartoon that was partially owned by Marvel. As a result, Fox would cancel both Marvel cartoons. Thus, sadly, the team never had a chance to make this 6th season. But when asked what it would be about, Eric Lewald said this. The 5-season series ends with a dying Charles Xavier being whisked away to space by Lilandra, where she can maintain his fragile body, but where it seems he will be gone forever from his beloved X-Men. It's like a death. Season 6 could open months later, with the X-Men in disarray. A few gone, the ones remaining at each other's throats, Lewald suggested. Then somehow they are called to, and transported to, an existential crisis on Lilandra's distant world. The team grudgingly reunites for Charles, heads off to space, solves the crisis, and as somehow healed Charles Xavier is either able to return to Earth with them, or if he can't, his heroic final sacrifice heals the team's wounds and they return to Earth as the proper X-Men again. Now, since the show's cancellation, some of the team members went on to work on several hit animated shows, like Guardians of the Galaxy and Star Wars Rebels. Over the years, the show gained an even larger following. Our own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is a fan of the series and was even hand-delivered a copy of Previously on X-Men by actors Cal Dodd and Allison Court, who voiced Wolverine and Jubilee respectively. For those of you who don't know, Previously on X-Men is a book written by Eric and Julia Lewald, both of whom worked on the show. And while the book does drag at times and kind of glosses over the decline of the show, the Lewalds pretty much attribute the gradual loss of quality to Saban's farming the animation out to a cheaper, crappier studio, and generic executives decreeing that there would be no more ongoing storylines outside of multi-part episodes. But still, the book is a must-read for any fan of animation and the series, especially since it portrays behind-the-scenes information on the production of X-Men, the animated series. By the bald head of Charles Xavier, was that script not chock full of interesting information and tidbits that even I didn't know? All I want to say is thank you so much for the support. If you listened to this episode from the beginning, you are truly a totally awesome geek. Now, do not forget to check out all the links in the description, and all I can say is stay awesome, geeks. Till next time.